Hi and welcome to my second video in the series about populations, and today we're going to be looking at sampling methods. So when we sample a given area, what we're doing is we're trying to find out the size of the populations of the organisms that live there, and essentially the types of organisms that live in a specific habitat or ecosystem. And the first way to do that is to use a piece of equipment called a quadrat, and hence the quad bike and the rat. Now, essentially a quadrat is a bit like a large grid, usually made out of some form of metal, and it essentially is a technique or a piece of apparatus that divides up land into small squares, a bit like this. And so the first thing that you would have to do in order to sample an area using a quadrat is you'd have to randomly generate some coordinates. Once you've gridded the area, you use these coordinates in order to pick out specific areas that you're going to sample. So rather than counting all the organisms that live in a given area, so if you were looking at sampling an area of 100 metres squared, it would be very difficult to count all of the species living in that area. What's better is to sample a specific section and then draw conclusions from that. Now, of course, what you would do if you were sampling an area is you wouldn't just do it once. You'd do a numerous number, and you'd do several repeats. And there's a couple of ways in which that you can determine how enough is enough. Probably the most well-used way is until you've covered 1% of the area. In some cases, obviously, that isn't going to be possible because even 1% of a given area can be quite a large amount. What you might decide is until the results are very similar, so in which you're getting results which are consistent. That might be when you decide that you've got enough data. So once you've gathered this information, you can use it in order to do a statistical test to determine the populations and to determine things like percentage cover. So quadrats are particularly useful if you wanted to do a sample of an area where you're trying to count a specific number of a specific organism. Let's say you were sampling a grass field and you were counting the number of grass plants in that field. Now, if you were looking at sampling an area where it changes quite markedly, then a transect is a better piece of equipment. And a transect is essentially a piece of strip of rope or a strip of line that has regular markings indicated on it. And what you would do is you would place this along an area, and then you would sample at the regular intervals and then see what organisms occurred there. Now, they're very good to measure change in ecosystems, particularly things like coastlines, because coastlines have different areas. So for instance, you have the kind of beachy, sandy area, that you then have a small shrub area, and then you start to go towards larger trees the further away you go from the beach or from the shorefront. So here we have a set of people actually doing a transect, and so this is the line, and it has several markers on it, so these people will go down the several markers and then mark down what organisms are there at that point. Now, those types of things can measure organisms that don't move around too much, things like plants. Now, if you were trying to estimate the amount of a living thing that does move around an animal, you'd use this method called mark-release recapture. And what mark-release recapture actually is it's where you take a first sample, so you capture a number of organisms. So let's say you were sampling the number of frogs. You would take a number in the first sample, so you'd capture the frogs, and then you'd multiply that by the number in the second sample. And so what you'd do is you'd leave enough time in between doing the samples, and then take a second capture, and you divide that number by the number of marked in the second sample. So when you took the first sample, you'd put a marker on the organism and then release them, and then come back maybe in a few days and then do another sample, and then hence the number divided by the marked in the second sample. Now, there are a number of considerations that you need to make when you do a mark-release recapture. One is that you leave enough time in order between the first and second sample, so you can't just do a sample and then an hour later do the second, obviously because there'd be not enough time for the captured ones to reintegrate into the ecosystem. You'd also have to not mark the organisms so that they stand out, so it's a selection bias against them. So obviously if you were capturing a frog, and some frogs rely on the camouflage, you wouldn't mark them with a huge bright colour, or for instance you wouldn't put a tag on them that impairs their movement, so they're more likely to get captured or eaten by a predator. So in summary, what we've gone through today is we've looked at when and where you do samples, we've looked at the different types of sampling methods, things like using quadrats and transects, and in what circumstances you'd use those pieces of equipment. We've also gone through another method of sampling called mark, release, recapture, and about the pitfalls that can be involved with that. If you join me next time, we'll be looking at predation.